Greetings, Slashaholics. This is David Bergantino, author of the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror books, the Bard's Blood horror Shakespeare books, and writer-designer of the upcoming horror video game, Return, One-Way Trip. You're listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian's narration of my book, Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
And now, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a novel by David Bergantino, based on the characters and script created by Wes Craven. This time, the terror doesn't stop at the screen.
Introduction. From the Journal of David Bergantino, North Hollywood, California, June 29th, 1994. 4:47 a.m. Finally finished the book. I'm lucky it didn't finish me first. What a great first opportunity it seemed, writing the novelization of a new Elm Street movie. It'd be an easy write, just adapt the screenplay into a novel, then I'd get some exposure. But no one ever told me exactly what I'd be exposed to. Still, a job's a job, an in's an in, and considering what I've been through, I think the book came out all right. It should do decent sales as movie novelizations go. Unsuspecting, horror-starved teens. Could anyone be horror-starved in today's world? Will read it and think they're simply enjoying a good, scary story. The journal and scrapbook tell the truth about the story of the book and the story behind the book. For the sake of everyone involved, I'll keep the truth to myself. Besides, there's a chance I'll get over my fear of writing and want to go back in the business. No need to burn bridges by airing anyone's bloody laundry. For now, I'm not sure what I'll do with myself. Probably won't even be able to hold a mall job, especially if the mall has a bookstore in it. I think I'll just go to the beach and think about it. Whatever happens, I should be all right. If the nightmares stop.
Prologue. The howling demons gathered, rumbling and roaring. Great silver snakes clung to the walls, hissing in chorus, dripping venom, waiting. Amid this hellish cacophony, a human figure worked methodically to create something unholy. A hammer struck, sparks flew, steel married sinew. A hand was taking shape. It was powerful, organic, and pulsed with a life all its own. This was the boiler room, where raging fires gave the demon furnaces their infernal voices. Clouds of steam billowed from valves and serpentine pipes. Drops of water fell from them into oily puddles. The boiler room, more sinister than ever, as the shadowy figure started to attach gleaming razors to the fingers of the metal hand, now a claw. Its true nature was revealed. It was the glove. His glove. The man affixed the final lethal blade to the last steel finger. Now complete, it trembled and flexed like some powerful newborn creature becoming aware of itself. The man caressed the claw, proud of his work. But he was not finished. Not yet. Despite the resemblance, this was no glove to be worn. It was solid, meant to be a part of the body, not a mere accessory. Putting the claw aside, the man rested his right hand on the work table. His left hand gripped the handle of a giant cleaver. The blade's firelight twisted shadow danced over the wrist of the man's right hand in anticipatory celebration. Then the cleaver struck, slicing through the man's wrist and biting into the table beneath. Ignoring the twitching hand, the man raised his gory stump. Thick blood gushed from severed veins and pulsating streams. "More blood!" someone shouted. "More blood!" Heather Langenkamp's 5-year-old son Dylan squirmed in her lap. Her hands held tight over his eyes. He had never been allowed to see one of her previous movies, yet somehow her husband Chase had talked her into bringing him on the set of this one. Yes, here she was making another Nightmare on Elm Street picture, and she wasn't sure why. But that was back when Heather was younger. caught up in the whole Hollywood living your dream excitement. Blood and violence never bothered her then. Now she was an adult with a husband and young son. In the intervening years, the world had become a dangerous and violent place. The television screens filled daily with news of real-life atrocities. And they didn't just happen in faraway foreign countries anymore. Her own neighborhood no longer seemed safe. In a world like that, what place did horror movies have? No wonder they were out of vogue. Still, Heather had always enjoyed making movies. She should be having fun. Sighing, she turned back to the scene being filmed. A camera moved in for a dramatic close-up of the bloody stump as it was thrust into the claw's cuff. Tendon snaked out of it, grafting the claw to the end of the actor's arm. It was a triumph of state-of-the-art special effects. Once the process was complete, the actor turned and slashed menacingly at the camera. "Cut!" called Wes Craven, the film's writer and director, and the father of Freddy Krueger. Fantastic! He was tall, skinny, and appeared utterly harmless. It was a wonder that such a nice guy from Cleveland had come up with a character as evil, yet somehow beloved as Freddy Krueger. A buzzer sounded and the lights went up. The faux demons' voices were snuffed and the serpent chorus dried up, replaced by the sounds of chatting. In less than a minute, the character of the place changed from that of a nightmare to something more like a church social. Heather removed her hands from Dylan's eyes. Craven ran up to Chase, the special effects supervisor on the film and designer of the mechanical claw. Chase Porter had been an assistant on the first Elm Street a decade ago. His courtship with Heather began when he faked a graphically bloody injury to attract her attention. At the time, she thought he was immature. So what that he was handsome and had a smile that gave her palpitations? Obviously, he was a perpetual juvenile, and she didn't want anything to do with a man like that. 2 years later, they were married. By the time Dylan arrived, Chase had started his own special effects company, working mostly in television commercials. He had worked hard, picked up a few low-budget feature films, and eventually landed the top effects job on the new Elm Street movie. And now he shepherded his own immature assistants. "You're a genius, Chase," Craven told him. "This makes Freddy's old hand look like Mother Teresa's." Chase thanked him modestly and with a nod indicated the 2 young men standing next to him, each holding syringes and tubing that led to the claw. Craven praised them just as enthusiastically. "You too, Terry, Chuck. Great blood." And he meant it. It had been great blood. The director's acknowledgment of them almost made the assistant swoon. "Thank you," squeaked Terry. "Some of our best work," Chuck replied, blushing. Well, at least Heather assumed by the tone of his voice that he was blushing. He was covered head to toe in sticky red liquid, so she couldn't be sure. Both in their late 20s, Terry was the tall, lanky Laurel to Chuck's somewhat overweight Hardy. They were as proficient a team of effects technicians as the silent screen team had been as comedians. Chase relied on them heavily. With one last thumbs up to Chase and his crew, Craven sped away to prepare for the next shot. Chase sat with Heather and Dylan while the assistants disconnected the claw from its tubing. After a minute, Chuck walked by with the dripping claw. Heather noticed her son staring at it. So did Chase. He reached over and rumpled Dylan's hair. "Want to see some neat stuff?" he asked with a wink and took Dylan by the hand. Heather stopped them. This wasn't the time for show and tell, especially not the place. Chase knew how she felt. "Chase, no," she protested, but before she could say more, Chase vetoed her. "Oh, come on. It's only make-believe." He pulled Dylan away from her, and the two plunged into the maze-like offset area. Heather hurried to catch up. At least she could keep them out of trouble. And then later she and Chase would have a talk about all of this. When she found them, Dylan was staring wide-eyed at a vast assortment of bloody body parts and demonic heads. But what she noticed were all the leering Freddy Krueger faces looking down at her from the shelves. Heather shuddered. This stuff was creepy enough to give her, and certainly Dylan, nightmares. Even looking away didn't help. She could somehow still feel Freddy's sightless eyes boring into her. Trying to ignore the disturbing sensation, she watched as Chase offered Dylan a carton of Chinese food. "You hungry, Dylan?" The container was placed in Dylan's hands before he could answer. He opened it, and the head of a fanged reptile sprang out, startling him. Terry and Chuck snickered in the background. "Gotcha!" Chase laughed and took the container back. "Chase!" snapped Heather. She didn't think that was very funny, but Dylan did, a smile coming to his face. Chase just winked at her, telling her to calm down. He turned over the container to show that the creature was only a puppet. Heather started to relax until Chuck brought the claw over to the workbench near her. "It should have flexed more," he told Chase. "I think the servos got shorted out with blood." Tech talk, she thought. Blah, blah, blah. "Insulate 'em with some, styro," Chase scolded his assistant good-naturedly. "It wasn't supposed to be submerged, for Pete's sake." Heather found herself staring at the claw. It was a car crash, or much worse, waiting to happen. She wanted Dylan taken home now. She was about to tell Chase that, but instead she said, "I don't like that thing." Chase looked at her funny. "This thing puts bread on our table." Maybe, but the fact remained that she did not like it, not in the least. Dylan, meanwhile, was trying to decide for himself. Finished with the reptilian jack-in-the-box, he eyed the claw warily, holding his father's hand for security. "Is it alive, Daddy?" Before he could answer, a voice called out, "Heather, you're in the next shot!" It came from no discernible direction, nor did it sound even vaguely familiar. Heather felt a little foggy. Chase began speaking, his voice floating to her from far away, even though they were in the same room. Had Dylan asked if the claw was alive? "Might as well be, Dylan. State-of-the-art animatronics, enhanced with bioorganic grafting." He listed the materials that made up the claw. Bull tendons, nerve bundles from a Doberman, even part of the brain of a homicidal primate was... The list seemed to go on forever. While Chase droned on, light flashed at the edge of her vision. On the work table, the claw had begun to move. Work lights glinted off the razors as they whirled slowly in the air. "Chase?" He saw it too and stopped talking. "Hey!" Chuck looked up from where he was making a sandwich. He was clearly surprised to see the claw in motion. Chase reached for the claw. In a metallic blur, it lashed out at him. He cried out in pain and pulled back. Blood dripped from his hand. The cuts didn't look too deep, mostly. Chase just seemed shocked. With his good hand, he shut off the remote. "Shit!" Chase swore under his breath. Chuck approached the claw, curious but unfazed. "Must have been picking up signals from the AD's walkie-talkies." With the screwdriver, he flipped the claw. It whined, a small half-machine, half-animal sound. Chills shot down Heather's spine. Terry put his hand on the claw and asked, "You sure it's turned off?" "It's off." "Funny, it's warm, like a real hand." Terry stepped away to give Chuck a closer look. He started to lean down. Heather would have stopped him, but the fog had drifted to her limbs. She couldn't move. Without warning, the claw flew at Chuck, burying the razors in his throat. He jerked back with a gurgling scream, grabbing at the claw, finally tearing it away. Chuck's throat became a horrific fountain, blood spurting from between his fingers. The claw landed on the table with a thump and skittered away, disappearing among the tools and equipment. A ball of terror formed inside Heather, and she rose swiftly. She managed to scream as Chase grabbed the remote and smashed it, throwing the batteries away. Just then, all the furnaces burst into flame at the same time. Steam howled from the giant pipes. Craven was shouting, "What the hell's going on here? Kill the effects!" But the noise soon drowned out his voice. Chuck crashed blindly into Chase, and they both went down. Terry raked through the jumble atop the workbench, searching for the claw. It emerged from behind some special effects rubble and quickly dropped to the floor. Heather could only watch as one razor sliced through Terry's ankle. He shrieked and fell, and when he hit the ground, the claw drove itself right into his heart, burying the long blades up to the still fingertips. His body convulsed once and was still. The claw wrenched itself out and spun around. It scrambled toward Chase, who was trying to untangle himself from Chuck's convulsing body. Heather's bawl of terror rose into a scream once more. Chase kept his eye on the claw as it sped toward him. He struggled harder to push Chuck away, but was pinned by his assistant's dead weight. The claw climbed up to Chuck's shoulder and perched there. The blade spread wide, casting thin shadows that divided Chase's face into segments. All at once the furnaces began to shake as if ready to explode. A horrible rumbling came from deep within the set. Chase shouted to Heather, but she was still paralyzed. Their eyes met as the claw tensed to leap at Chase, and she could do nothing. Nothing at all. Everything went black. Someone was shaking her. "Heather! Earthquake!" Chase's voice. She was vaguely aware that Chase was trying to pull her from the bed. He was shaking too. So was the entire room. "Get in the doorway!" He had to yell above the rumbling noise and the sounds of breaking glass. "Mommy!" Her son's voice instantly jump-started her consciousness. "Dylan!" She was now fully awake as the floor pitched her out of the doorway. A framed picture fell, a shower of glass narrowly missing Chase as he staggered behind her. They bounced down the hall to Dylan's room. He was trapped in bed by the constant movement of the earth. Before Heather could reach him, there came one last huge jolt. Then it stopped. Not yet convinced the earthquake was truly over, nobody moved for several seconds. Pulsating electronic sounds floated in from the street. The image of landing spaceships jumped into Heather's mind, the earthquake announcing their arrival. She could almost believe that. This was Los Angeles after all. "Car alarms," Chase said, noticing her perplexed look. "Are you okay?" She nodded as she lifted Dylan, who had begun to cry softly. He was hot, his pajamas soaked in sweat. What a big scare for her little guy. Dylan had inherited his father's looks, but for the most part he got his personality from his mother. She sometimes worried about how serious and adult-like he was most of the time. He never quite seemed relaxed. When she told Chase her worries, he said that just because the boy was intense didn't mean anything was wrong, or that he wasn't happy. And it's not like he doesn't know how to have fun. Chase would offer as his final proof. That was true. Dylan wasn't a moper. He played just like the other kids, though more intensely. Chase wasn't given to denial, and his words made sense. He cared deeply for Dylan and was a good father. She knew that she tended to worry too much. Good mothers did that. "You okay, Chief?" Chase asked gently. "No." But the tears had stopped. Dylan was trying to be brave for Mommy and Daddy. This was when she was worried most, when he held things in. He was still radiating heat. "You have a fever, sweetie?" Dylan shook his head. She kissed his forehead to check his temperature. Her own mother used to do that, calling it a thermometer, and although Dylan was warm, he didn't have a fever. "Just an earthquake, Dylan." Chase rubbed Dylan's back to comfort him. "Every once in a while we get a few." "No biggie, really," said Heather, but Dylan wasn't entirely convinced yet. Dylan looked up as his father brushed his hair away from his eyes. The frightened look on his face made him seem older than his 5 years. "Daddy, blood," Dylan said quietly, and pointed. Heather followed his gaze and saw blood dripping from Chase's hand. Panic started seeping into her from cracks made by the earthquake. It was the same hand that had been slashed in her dream. Chase saw her look and wrapped his bleeding fingers in one of Dylan's t-shirts. "Nothing, guys," he said quickly. "Just a scratch." It's worse than that, Heather thought. The t-shirt was already soaked with blood. "Where'd you get that?" she asked nervously. Chase shrugged. The picture, I guess. But she wasn't really listening, only staring at his hand. When it fell, it's nothing, really. The tone of his voice made her look up. She saw by his expression he was trying hard to convince her so that she wouldn't upset Dylan. I'll put a bandage on it. Don't worry about it. Then he flashed both of them a big, don't worry, be happy smile and left the room. But Heather was worried about it, very much. And by the look on his face, so was Dylan. But she decided to follow Chase's lead and try not to upset their son any further. The earthquake had been bad enough. So she smiled at Dylan and told him that Daddy would be all right. As she set him down on the bed, she wondered how Chase could have gotten that cut. From the picture, he said. Of course, that must be it. She quickly accepted the explanation. It was the only one that made sense. Another possibility occurred to her, but it was a little nutty. Actually, it was, what kind of basket would you like to weave today, crazy? Heather forced the thought from her mind, but it took effort.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, May 9th, 1994. Slow getting started. Always happens this way. Thought I remembered an earthquake like the one in the script. Went to the library and voila! Found the article below. Very cool. I wonder if he added any other little touches to give the story authenticity. If I have time, I'll check it out.
Los Angeles Times, March 16, 1993. 5.5 quake rocks Los Angeles. Associated Press. San Fernando Valley. An earthquake measuring 5.5 on the Richter scale shook Los Angeles in the morning hours, jolting people from their beds and breaking glass all over the city. It was the latest in what seismologists are calling a swarm of related seismic activity. The epicenter was located in the city of Silma in the North San Fernando Valley. No serious damage or injuries were reported. The earthquake was felt as far south as San Diego and as far east as Las Vegas.
Chapter 1. Earthquakes are insatiable lovers of kitchens. No other room in the house has as many small breakable objects per square foot that are as easily dislodged. Heather's kitchen showed signs of a torrid affair. Every cabinet door had flown open and the contents dumped out. Whatever could shatter invariably did when it hit the floor. Chase swept the broken glass into one corner, while Heather started through what remained in the cupboards. Some of the sturdier coffee mugs had survived, along with some plates that had been at the bottom of a stack. As Heather went about reorganizing the cupboard, a similar process was taking place within her mind, with less success. In the shadows of both places were sharp fragments that could cut her if she wasn't careful. The nightmare had frightened her far more than the earthquake. Each aftershock, they'd had a few small ones, brought her closer to screaming. They reminded her of how she felt when the furnaces seemed about to explode. It was only a dream, she kept telling herself. Like the rest, she'd had several nightmares in the last 2 months, only this one was worse. A fearful voice deep inside her whispered. She silenced it. Even if it was worse, she thought, it was still only a dream. But the fearful voice didn't go away. It simply floated quietly in her mind, waiting for the next opportunity to speak up. Every time it did, the voice was louder and more shrill. In a far corner of the cupboard she was sorting through, Heather spotted a cup lying on its side. It was made of bone china and was decorated with a flowered design. At first glance she thought it had survived the earthquake, but then she saw the jagged spikes where the handle had broken off. The flowers were now caught in a spiderweb of cracks, and a large chip scarred the rim. It had been a beautiful cup, one of her favorites. She sighed, the sound mingling with that of the kettle that began to whistle on the stove. Heather shuddered, remembering the steam pipes of the boiler room. Chase stopped sweeping and took the kettle off the burner. Heather looked over. Now there was a bright spot in her day, watching Chase in the kitchen. Most mornings he'd be wearing only pajama bottoms. At the moment he wore a robe and heavy slippers to protect himself from broken glass. It'd be a while before he could walk around without wearing something on his feet. Too bad, she thought. He had perfect feet. Luckily, the rest of his body was just as pleasant to look at. Through exercise, he avoided excess bulge around the middle so many men acquired shortly after hitting 30. Okay, so maybe he had begun to grow hair on his back, but that wasn't enough to make her hire a lawyer and begin divorce proceedings. In all, she felt lucky to have him as her bright spot every day. Chase brought her some instant coffee and one of the Survivor mugs. She took it and held up the flowered cup. "One of my mom's cups got broken." He took it from her, examined it, and handed it back. "I'm sorry," he said dutifully. "At least we're in one piece, though." He gave her a half smile and shrugged. Chase wasn't big on sentiment, and turned to the table for a piece of toast. He was right, of course. It was a habit of his, to be right, that somehow never became annoying. Heather was thankful that, except for the cut on Chase's hand, none of them had been hurt during the quakes. Still, this particular set of cups was one of the few pleasant reminders of an often stormy relationship with her mother. And just like that, Heather stumbled upon a dangerous shard in her mind. Her mother. Painful memories threatened to surface. She barely held them at bay with the thought that today might be a good day to start seeing a shrink. An excellent day, in fact. A professional talk might be just the thing to exorcise some demons and silence some voices. Unfortunately, the earthquake probably gave a lot of people the same idea. Appointments might be scarce. The sudden blare of the living room television interrupted her latest self-distraction. A story on the earthquake was just ending. The local newscaster described the morning's events as the latest of what seismologists are calling, and then he paused in the melodramatic fashion that even the network anchors had begun to adopt and intoned gravely, "A swarm." After another brief pause, the newscaster, now raising his left eyebrow to show concern, launched into a report on bloody battles in the Eastern European republics. He spoke over graphic footage that showed the aftermath of a mortar attack. Dylan sat at the counter having breakfast, not watching the television, but absorbing the ghastly news all the same. Little kids didn't need death and violence along with their cereal, Heather thought. "Do we have to watch that?" she snapped at Chase, assuming he was responsible. But he was on the other side of the kitchen, finishing up the sweeping. He turned and blinked at her, surprised at the tone of her voice. I thought you turned it on," he said mildly, and walked into the living room to switch off the television. It took him a minute to find the remote, onto which a pile of magazines had toppled. Heather ignored Chase's questioning look and turned to Dylan. He wasn't eating breakfast so much as sculpting it. The peaks and valleys of his oatmeal formed a face. Large, feral eyes stared out, and a mouth gaped savagely. The image was vaguely familiar and very disconcerting. Suddenly, Heather was about to laugh. Of all things, she was working herself into a frenzy over oatmeal. It was absurd. She imagined herself at a police station, sitting behind smoked glass, staring at a lineup of thugs that included such well-known criminal elements as a bowl of Cheerios, buttered toast, and a glass of orange juice. A Pop-Tart. The unfrosted ones were prone to violence. The farina looked familiar, but no. Then, the oatmeal officer! It was the oatmeal! Case closed. The laughter, which would have been hysterical and uncontrollable had it escaped, died in her throat when she looked back down at Dylan's bowl. The face remained, and her little instant mind movie hadn't made it seem any less menacing. "Dylan," she said too sharply, "it's breakfast, not arts and crafts." He looked up at her abruptly with his innocent, curious eyes, just like his father's eyes. Chase had stopped moving behind her. She could feel him watching. "What?" she asked, spinning around to face him. Chase didn't speak immediately, but chose his words carefully to make sure he would not upset her. "You get any sleep last night?" he finally said. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Dylan staring, waiting to see if Chase's question would set her off. She became painfully aware of how her mood was affecting her family. Her shoulders sagged, and she took a deep breath. More or less. She turned back to Dylan. He tensed, unsure of how she was going to speak to him. "Dylan, time to get dressed." The fight was out of her for the moment, and she felt more exhausted than anything else. I'm late." Now Dylan was frowning. "You going away?" "Just for a few hours. Julie'll be with you." To her surprise, Dylan just sighed, pushed his chair away from the table, and went up to his room. Chase, satisfied for the moment that Heather wasn't on the verge of another outburst, followed Dylan out of the kitchen. Julie was Heather's best friend and Dylan's favorite babysitter. She absolutely adored Dylan. There had been other sitters, nannies, college kids, daughters of friends, but lately Heather hadn't felt comfortable leaving Dylan with anyone else. Luckily, Julie was eager to help out. Perhaps it was because she had no children of her own yet, but Heather didn't think so. She was just that kind of a friend. Dylan's lack of enthusiasm was puzzling at first. Normally, Julie was the magic word. News of Julie's impending arrival always thrilled him. Sometimes his reaction would even make Heather a little jealous. The earthquake must have been a bigger scare than he let on, she figured. Alone in the kitchen, Heather started to clear the table. She reached for Dylan's breakfast bowl and froze. The evil, grinning face stared up at her. Wielding Dylan's spoon as if it were Excalibur, she plunged it into the oatmeal and stirred. The face was gone before she reached the sink. But she didn't feel any better, even after she scraped the oatmeal into the drain and turned the disposal on for a full minute. Up in the bedroom, Heather dressed in silence. She could feel Chase studying her from across the room. In the cracked mirror, she saw what he was looking at, her slim, attractive body and thick auburn hair that spilled over her shoulders. Unfortunately, the mirror also showed the dark circles under her eyes. That's the thing about stress, she thought. It's great for the figure, but not so great for the face. Chase wrapped his arms around her shoulders. For a terrifying moment, she didn't recognize his touch. Then she could feel his heart beating, strong and steady as he hugged her against his chest. "Anything other than the obvious bothering you?" 5 earthquakes in 3 weeks isn't enough? But she knew he wasn't talking about earthquakes. Chase's look of concern was reflected in the mirror. It wasn't the usual expression he wore before leaving town, as he was doing that morning. A commercial job was going to take him to Palmdale for 2 days. He was always reluctant to leave her and Dylan, especially in recent weeks. Today he seemed particularly sensitive to her mood. "There hasn't been another call, has there?" Just the thought of the phone calls made her tense. They had started almost 2 months ago and gone on for several weeks. Somebody with a deep, cruel voice and chilling laugh, pretending to be her film nemesis Freddy Krueger. The voice would not threaten her exactly, but taunt. Whoever it was had sounded truly dangerous, and he would only call when she was nearby to answer the phone, like he knew she was there. He had been in her mail as well. Grimy envelopes had appeared. They were unaddressed, and each contained only one thing, a sheet of paper on which was pasted a single letter, cut from a newspaper headline. One day, both the calls and the letters just stopped. So she answered Chase with a shake of her head. "Good." Chase's tone of voice changed. He was trying to lend her some of his strength. "Maybe he got run over by a truck." "If anything, he feels closer," she told him, crushing his attempt to make light of the situation. His earnest look faltered a bit. She knew how frustrated he became when she wouldn't allow him to console her. That was why Heather didn't want to mention the latest nightmare. Chase couldn't make her feel any better about that either, but she couldn't ignore the look in his eyes. He knew there was more to her story this morning than the earthquake, and he wanted to help. Identify the problem and solve it. That was his way. "It's giving me nightmares," she finally admitted. "You have one last night?" She nodded yes. He hugged her again and started stroking her hair. At times like these, she was his little girl. His voice would become deep and soothing, and he'd talk her fears away. It often worked. "It's just a reaction to the earthquake, Heather." "Maybe." But she wasn't feeling safe or comfortable right now, even in his arms. Too much had happened lately. "Or maybe I shouldn't do this interview today." She was due to appear on a local talk show this morning. It was her first television appearance in a very long time. At first she had thought it would do her some good. Right now she wasn't so sure. Chase turned her around so they faced each other. "You've got to get back on the horse sometime." Frustration crept back into his voice. She didn't help matters by rolling her eyes at his cliché. He released her and began to pace. "Look, you had a nutcase making harassing phone calls. I know how scary that feels." "No, you don't," she broke in. He had only heard the voice from the safety of a police recording. "Okay," he said softly, "but it still doesn't mean it can't be over with." "What if it isn't over?" She was challenging him and pleading for an answer at the same time. He considered her question and decided to change his approach. "Maybe you should just tell me your dream." She shrugged. Maybe it wasn't worth discussing. In perspective, the nightmare was really the least of her worries. But Chase wasn't giving her a choice now. Besides, she had made such an issue of it. "It was nothing," she said, but the tremble in her voice contradicted her words. "We were both working on some movie, and a special effects thing went horribly wrong. Terry and Chuck were hurt." Her mind flashed a picture of their bloody corpses. She pushed it away and continued. "You were almost—" She could see the shadows of the claws across his face. You were even cut." She looked down fearfully at his hand. For a moment Chase seemed a little frightened himself. It occurred to her that he might not really know how he cut his hand, but didn't want to scare her. He never talked about dreams, so it was possible he had even had a nightmare too. Recently she'd watched him toss in bed at night, but in the morning he claimed to have forgotten if he had been dreaming. Looking at his face again, she saw that the fear was gone, if it had been there in the first place. "You were probably half awake and saw me get nicked by that picture glass. Dreams work like that." He was trying very hard to convince her. She wished she could believe him. "You want me not to go on this job?" he asked suddenly. This offer had come fairly often in the last 2 months. Heather had never taken him up on it, but this time she came close. But it wouldn't be fair to neither of them. She was a grown woman, his wife, not his little girl. Not anybody's little girl anymore. She steadied herself with a good, swift mental kick in the butt and squeezed his hands. "Just be careful," she said, shaking her head. "I should survive 2 days in Palmdale supplying soap bubbles for a detergent commercial, don't you think?" He was holding her with his eyes again. Heather suddenly felt silly about all of this. He certainly wasn't going to cut himself on bubbles. "Guess so," she said. Chase seemed unconvinced that she had recovered so quickly. Truth was, she was still very shaken, but she wanted him to be able to leave without worrying too much. So she gave him a bright smile. He tried to resist, but finally the smile did the trick. 48 hours, he said with a wink. "I'll be back before you know it." He gave her a quick kiss, but did not let go of her. Then they kissed again, this time long enough to last them the next 2 days. With that, he picked up his overnight bag and turned to leave. Heather closed her eyes. Another minute, and she would have begged him to stay, and that would have ruined it for both of them. She heard him say goodbye to Dylan. Then the front door closed. He was gone. 48 hours. An eternity. Heather let her breath out slowly as she calmed down. Then she heard an unexpected brittle snap and opened her eyes. A crack appeared on her bedroom wall, then another. Soon 4 thin, parallel cracks snaked diagonally down the wall in front of her eyes. She stared at them, her disbelief rapidly giving way to terror. Her fearful inner voice rose up suddenly, speaking over the sound of the television that had just come on downstairs. "Stop him!" the voice cried. Don't let Chase leave. She listened to it and bolted down the stairs. The image on the living room television stopped her in her tracks. Her own terrified face stared out from the screen. But it wasn't her face exactly. It was Nancy, that character she played in A Nightmare on Elm Street. And less than a foot from the screen was Dylan, watching the movie impassively on the screen. Tina's corpse appeared in the doorway to the classroom, shrouded by a bloody body bag. "Nancy," moaned Tina. "Dylan, I don't want you watching that." Heather's anger momentarily displaced her fear. Dylan knew better than to watch that kind of movie, even if his mother was in this particular one. She grabbed the remote and zapped off the television. Then she angrily tore the plug out of the wall for good measure. Instantly, Dylan began howling as if she were beating him. "Dylan, stop it!" she yelled, barely able to hear herself over his howling. "What's gotten into you?" The phone rang and Dylan immediately became silent. She looked down at him and he stared up, his eyes reflecting the pain she had heard in his howling. The phone rang again. She snatched it up, not taking her eyes off of her son. "Hello?" A strange static was her only reply. She quickly realized the sound wasn't static at all, but the crackling of flames. Soon they roared in her ears. Then that voice. 1, 2, came a raspy sing-song. It was the caller, flawlessly imitating the voice of Freddy Krueger. The murderous, mocking tone was perfect, and perfectly terrifying. The furnace noises enhanced the effect. She slammed down the phone and ran for the front door. By the time she got to the front step, Chase's pickup truck was disappearing down the street. She waved her arm, but he must have thought she was only saying a last goodbye. He honked and drove out of sight. Still very frightened, she went back into the house, closing the door behind her. Dylan still sat in front of the television, gazing up at her with the same awful look as before. "Someone's coming," he said ominously. "What, Dylan? No one's coming here." At that moment the ground lurched slightly, rattling the house. She ran to Dylan and they braced for another aftershock. But the ground stopped moving. Then the doorbell rang. All at once Heather was certain that her personal Freddy had come for her. The last call must have been made from a sidewalk payphone. She watched the door, ready for it to burst inward, knocking her to the ground. Then her tormentor would enter. No doubt he was large, powerful, and quite insane. Would Dylan get away? Would he kill her immediately? Or would he first... "Heather?" The voice coming from outside wasn't even male, let alone threatening. Julie had arrived, as she and Dylan had expected. Heather shook off the latest assault of paranoia and opened the door. Julie was blue-eyed, pretty in an uncomplicated way, with straight, straw-colored hair. Usually a broad grin perched on her face, but not at the moment. The corners of her blue eyes crinkled at Heather's haggard appearance. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, Julie, I'm sorry. I thought..." She couldn't tell her friend what she had really been thinking. "There was an earthquake, I think. A little one, but..." "Big truck went by right before you opened the door. Life on the fault line," she proclaimed brightly. Julie was one of those terminally cheerful people, just the kind of person Heather needed to lift her spirits. Dylan stood a few feet away, waiting to be seen. Heather stepped back and let Julie in. "Hey, Tiger!" She rushed right to him and hoisted Dylan into the air. He started to giggle. Good. His spirits could use some lifting, too. Still, the morning was not over, and Heather's feeling of dread hadn't fully subsided. The effects of the phone call, not to mention Dylan's bizarre behavior, were not easily overcome. At least Julie could help with Dylan. "You think he has a fever?" Heather asked. "He felt warm to me this morning." Julie put her hand on Dylan's forehead and shrugged. "Seems okay to me." "That's all that's wrong? You seem..." The ringing phone interrupted Julie. Heather snatched up the phone immediately. He's not going to get me like before, she thought. A few minutes ago she hadn't expected the call. She had been off balance. Not this time. Not by a long shot. Leave us alone, you creep! She shouted into the phone. The line was silent. Perhaps she had shocked the lunatic into forgetting to activate his furnace sound effect. L.A. limousine, ma'am, said a startled voice. Just wanted you to know I'm out front. The limo. Sure enough, a black limo sat at the curb in front of her house. Sorry. Hang on a minute. Oh, good move, Heather. She set the receiver down and leaned on it a moment with her eyes closed. Then she looked up at Julie. The other woman was stunned. Dylan was at Julie's side now, holding her hand. Heather, what is it? Dylan grew sullen again. The joy that lit up his face seconds ago had already faded. Dunno. I just have this feeling today. She trailed off. She didn't want to talk. Crying seemed to be next on the agenda, but she didn't want to do that either. Mommy, stay home, said Dylan. Then he turned and went up to his room without another word. It wasn't a request. His tone implied that he was giving her vitally important advice that he expected her to follow without question. Heather watched him leave. A minute ago he'd actually laughed. Julie read the sad expression and winked. He'll be fine, don't worry. She went off after Dylan. Soon conspiratorial whispers drifted down from his room. Julie was attempting to cheer Dylan up. So far it was slow going. Heather listened at the bottom of the stairs. No matter what toy Julie suggested or what cartoonish voice she spoke in, his monotones indicated he hadn't cheered up. I won't leave him like this, Heather decided, so she picked up the phone and dialed. Studio B, answered a generic Studio B-like voice. Hi, this is Heather Langenkamp. She tried hard to sound breezy and casual. They weren't going to like this. The car not there yet? He asked brightly. No, She couldn't sustain the breezy bullshit and lowered her voice. Listen, I can't make it today. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could hear sounds in the background, but they were normal, generic Studio B-like sounds. No flames, no steam. You're kidding, right? The voice was in a panic. Heather understood what a horrible thing she was doing, but she couldn't help it. I'm sorry, I can't, she stammered. But Mr. Studio B was now angry and cut her off. Listen, damn it! But she couldn't listen, and he wouldn't listen to her, because her explanation would make no sense. Even if it did, judging by the tone of his voice, there was nothing acceptable she could say. I just can't, she said, and hung up on Mr. Studio B. That had been a tough call, not something she did that often. Reliability was very important to her, in others and in herself. But she had made the decision, or rather Dylan had made it for her. A giggle escaped from the bedroom. Julie was getting through. And how would he feel when he found out Mommy was staying home? Well, let's see how that floats his boat, she thought, as she started for his room. The ringing phone stopped her. It was Mr. Studio B, no doubt, or the limo driver. Either way, she couldn't very well pretend she was at home. She lifted the receiver and stilled herself. Yes? A loud hissing answered her. Steam pipes. 1, 2, sang Freddy, catching her off guard once more. She slammed the phone down, almost smashing it. Jesus! God, what timing this psycho had! Then the phone rang again. She stared at the phone for a moment in shock. If it's him, she thought, but what if it isn't? She had to answer it, and civilly. Her hand did not want to grasp the receiver. Hello? She barely managed. Freddy's coming for you! Greeted her. She recoiled as if she'd been slapped and slammed the phone down hard. Turning, she vented her anger by kicking a chair. It knocked over a lamp that had survived the earthquake. The ceramic base shattered against the wall, and the whole mess fell to the ground. It didn't make her feel any better. Instead, she was sweaty, breathing heavily, and her foot hurt. Heather took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Suddenly, she was aware of someone standing behind her. She whirled. Julie stood on the bottom step, shocked. What is it, Heather? Dylan peered out from behind her legs. Heather tried to compose herself. Damn caller again. He started again? Julie immediately became very sympathetic. She knew all about the caller and how hard it had been on her friend. She came over and gave Heather a hug. Heather nodded. She was too drained to speak. On top of that, she was looking at Dylan. Fear burned in his eyes. But was it more than fear? Despair, really. What could a 5-year-old know about despair? Perhaps he had seen it on the faces of war or famine victims on the news, but that didn't really explain it. He wasn't mimicking despair. The emotion itself radiated from him like the heat of a fever. "And it's your fault," whispered the fearful voice. Heather could not deny it. A gloomy quiet blanketed the room. Julie started looking uncomfortable. Suddenly she smiled over brightly and broke the silence with apparently the first words that came to her mind. "Sick bastard," she said before she could catch herself. Heather looked at her sharply. "Sorry." She flushed immediately and changed the subject. "Dylan, he doesn't have a fever like you were worried. Probably just your nerves." "Nerves?" Heather asked, stung by Julie's words. "Don't you think I can handle this?" she wanted to scream. "I'm not my mother." But the words didn't come out. She was too shocked. Julie must have realized what she was thinking, because her face became even redder. "I just meant from the shaker this morning." She was babbling now, hoping to mend the situation. I mean, everyone's freaked out at how many we've been having." "Then the calls?" Heather was about to shut Julie up before her other foot became lodged in her mouth, when the phone rang again. In her anger, she lashed out at the phone. "Stop calling me, you son of a bitch!" she screeched into the mouthpiece. Dylan shrank behind Julie's legs. Heather waited, hoping the psycho had something to say this time. "You talk to your agent this way?" It was Jerry. No doubt he had gotten a frantic call from Mr. Studio B. She was in for it now. Normally Jerry was a sweet old man, the Jewish grandfather she never had. He was an agent from the old school, not a flashy mover or shaker, like the young hotshots of modern Hollywood. But he was no dinosaur. To this day he could outmove and outshake the sharpest of the "let's do lunch" crowd. But now her sweet Jewish grandfather was pissed off. "And you try to cancel an appearance on AMLA at the last damn minute? What the hell's with you?" "I'm sorry, Jerry. I can't leave the house right now." "Please understand," she wished silently. "What? You want to single-handedly bury your career? Lose your house? Put your husband and kid out on the street? Or just give your old agent a heart attack?" he added, trying to inject some humor into the situation. They were all ludicrous notions, anyway, but Heather couldn't defend herself. She could tell he was livid. "Okay, fine, I'll be there. It's just, the calls started again." The battle won, Jerry the grandfather relieved Jerry the agent from duty. "Unfortunately, this kind of crap is part of the business these days, Heather. Have you thought of buying a good handgun?" "I've got a 5-year-old in the house, Jerry." "He's an L.A. kid. Probably already has one." Jerry laughed, quickly telling her. "Kidding." He expressed sympathy in odd ways, but she knew he was sincere. Then the agent returned. "Look, call me after the interview, okay?" And the line went dead. No one ever said goodbye these days. They just hung up. During the conversation, Julie had retreated with Dylan up to his room. She now sat on the floor playing with his toy dinosaurs as he sat silently on the bed. They both looked up when Heather entered the room. Julie was trying hard not to say anything. She had already gotten herself into enough trouble. Dylan looked up sadly, knowing what came next. "Honey, I gotta go. Forgive me?" She lifted him off the bed and gave him a big hug. He hugged her in return, but weakly. The morning had been very hard on both of them. Minutes later, Julie and Dylan stood in the front doorway to see Heather out. "I'll call the cops for you," Julie said. Her mood lightened considerably. "You've got the number on the fridge, right?" "Thanks. Just give them the time he called. They're keeping a list. Supposedly." Julie nearly had to push Heather out the front door. Any later and her friend would be watching the show from the limo's tiny television. Just when she thought Heather was on her way, she turned and gave Julie a big hug. "Sorry I snapped at you," she apologized. "My nerves are a little raw these days." "It's okay," Julie replied. And it was okay. Besides, the job description of best friend called for understanding in extraordinary circumstances, and Heather's circumstances were extraordinary, to say the least. She really didn't know who could handle what Heather was going through without cracking, even slightly, and that worried Julie sick. But she had slipped badly when she had implied, however innocently, that Heather was imagining things. Heather had confided her family history, stories about her mother and especially her grandmother, and was very sensitive about the subject. Julie meant nothing by her comments, and Heather knew it too, but she should have been more careful. Those moments had been more than a little tense for everyone, so Julie forgave herself. She knew Heather had forgiven her. She and Dylan both waved goodbye from the front step. Heather waved back. Julie thought the smile almost looked natural, and walked toward the limousine. As she approached the car, Heather was almost convinced the day was going to turn out all right. Then she saw the driver. From the back, she could see him speaking into the car phone. He was a big man and bald. The light reflected off the back of his head unevenly, creating the illusion of scarred flesh. She stopped. Freddy Krueger was driving her limousine. He turned toward her, and suddenly he was just a bald, middle-aged limo driver, anxious to get underway. Heather forced herself into motion and got into the limousine. Okay, folks, this has been the prologue and Chapter 1 of Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a novel by David Bergantino. You know, this is actually the first direct novelization of a movie that we've done so far on the channel. This is the 30th slasher book we've done, but all the ones before have been original stories. This is actually the first direct adaptation that we've done on the channel, and I'm excited to start with this one. Usually at this point of the upload, I would do a review of the upload tonight, but I'm going to be doing something a little differently on this book, because when I'm finished narrating this book, I'm going to be doing an in-depth review of the movie and the book, and I got some fun stuff planned for that review. It'll be a full-length video for the channel, and I just didn't want it to take away from how great this book is, so I'll do my review once I've completed the book, and my review will be on the movie and the novelization of the movie. And I got some cool, fun stuff planned for that. I think you guys will enjoy it. Also, tonight's upload was brought to you by Carl Eakin, Sean Campbell, Cecilia Spears, and Catherine McClear over on the Patreon. Guys, if you love this channel and enjoy the content and want to help keep this channel growing and going, once you click the link in the description below and head over to that Patreon page and sign up to become a sponsor of the channel, we got tiers starting at $2 a month. That will get you early access to certain content, and it will get you a bonus entry in any giveaways on live streams on the YouTube channel. You'll have 2 entries instead of 1. There's a $5 tier that gets you a free ebook emailed to you every 3 months of membership, a free gift from the merch store every 12 months. You get that bonus entry and drawings, and you also get early access to some great content before it reaches the YouTube channel. There's also a $15 tier and a $50 tier that come with all the things I listed from the $2 and $5 tier, plus so much more. Guys, just hit the link, check it out. I think you'd really enjoy the rewards, and you get to support the channel and help it keep going and growing. Also, guys, before I leave tonight, I want to say thank you to David Bergantino for supplying the voice for himself in the journal entries from his novel here. And thank you to Dino from the Dino and Ted Show. Great channel, guys. You've got to go check them out if you haven't done so already. He voiced the Scrapbook Narrator, the little news story we had there. And both of these gentlemen will continue to play these parts throughout the entire novel. Well, guys, that's going to wrap it up for me tonight. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, happy Halloween, and pleasant screams!